In 1950, around when your grandparents might have been in high school, prices were much lower than they are today. In that year, a can of Coke cost a nickel and a movie cost about 50 cents. College tuition at private universities averaged under $300 per year. Tuition at state colleges was even lower, well under $100 per year. In fact, the price of most goods was a lot lower in 1950 than today. Of course, incomes were lower too, and so was the weekly allowance of the typical high school student. But the fact remains that prices, on average, have increased almost every year since 1950 and in most of the years before 1952. To understand how and why prices change, it's useful to establish some terminology. So, in this module, the key idea we are going to look at is that inflation reduces the purchasing power of money. And to do that, we'll accomplish the following objectives. I'll first explain how we measure inflation. Then I'll explain what causes inflation and why high inflation is considered to be such a problem. We'll identify the dangers of deflation and conclude with that. So, we've already seen that the price level is a broad measure of the prices for goods and services in the economy, not a measure of the price of one particular item. So we'll discuss now specific ways to measure the price level in this section. A rise in the price level is called inflation. When we use the term inflation rate, it's the annual percentage increase in the price level from one year to the next. Of course, there is something called the opposite of inflation, and that is deflation. That is a decline in the price level. When there is deflation, the inflation rate is negative. As you're about to see, inflation and deflation can create serious problems for the economy. But before we discuss these problems, let's look at how the government actually measures inflation. To determine the inflation rate, the government must first measure the price level. There are several ways of measuring the price level that can result in somewhat different measures of inflation. For many purposes, including those of the U.S. government, the Consumer Price Index is the favored price level gauge. The Consumer Price Index is defined as measuring the overall level of prices faced by a typical consumer. To construct the CPI, the government first determines what is called a market basket of goods and services. This is a bundle that an average consumer might buy. Then what the government does is they track the cost of this market basket over time. If the price of the market basket rises by 10% over some time period, the CPI will rise by 10% as well. Of course, every consumer buys different goods and even different brands of the same goods. So the market basket is actually a hypothetical bundle of goods that is broadly representative of typical purchases. For example, suppose the average American family buys 5 boxes of breakfast cereal each month. The Jones family might buy mostly Cheerios, while the Smith family might buy Apple Jacks, and so on. To help the CPI reflect the variety of consumer purchases, the market basket includes many different types of popular cereals. The same is done for other goods and services: gasoline, bananas, dresses, car repairs, and so on. The government regularly conducts a survey of urban households to learn what goods people actually buy, so it can update the market basket to mirror changes in purchasing patterns. The 8 main categories of consumer goods included in the market basket for December 2010, along with each category's share of the total market basket, are shown right here in this figure. You can see housing makes up about 41.5%, transportation 17.3%, people spend about 14.8% of their income on food and beverages, and so on down the line. So, how does the government actually calculate the CPI? Each month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics sends out shoppers, like Margaret Humphrey, to gather 84,000 prices for the goods and services that the typical urban resident might buy. Urban or city residents make up about 87% of the U.S. population. The prices the shoppers gather are used to determine the cost of the market basket for that month. To determine the CPI, the government compares the cost of the market basket in the current month with its cost at a time in the past that has been selected as a benchmark, and we call that the base period. More specifically, the CPI is calculated using the following formula. CPI in a given month is the cost of the market basket in the given month divided by the cost of the market basket in the base period multiplied by 100. Now, notice that when the CPI is calculated for the base period itself, its value is 100. That's because when the given month and the base period are the same, the CPI formula becomes the cost of the market basket in the base period divided by itself, which is always 1, multiplied by 100. For example, if the cost of the market basket is $1.2 million in the base period, the CPI for the base period would be $1.2 million divided by $1.2 million times 100, and that would equal 1 times 100, which would equal 100. For any month when the market basket costs more than in the base period, the CPI will be greater than 100. Likewise, for any month when the market basket costs less than in the base period, the CPI will be less than 100. Changes in the CPI tell us how prices are changing. When most prices are rising, the cost of the market basket increases, so the CPI rises. A rise in the CPI is an indicator of inflation. When prices are falling, the cost of the market basket decreases, so the CPI falls. A fall in the CPI is an indicator of deflation. The current base period for CPI calculations is the 3 years from 1982 to 1984. So the denominator of the formula for the CPI is the average cost of the market basket from 1982 to 1984. In March of 2006, the CPI had a value of 199.8. This tells us that the market basket cost almost twice as much in March of 2006 as its average cost during the 1982 to 1984 base period. By late 2012, the CPI had reached 230. The CPI is just one among many measures of the price level. Another is what we call the Producer Price Index, the PPI, which measures the cost of a basket of goods and services bought by producers rather than by consumers. Changes in the PPI normally show up before changes in the CPI because producers experience price changes for raw materials and intermediate goods before consumers feel changes in retail prices for goods and services. Because producers will eventually pass higher costs onto wholesalers and retailers, economists look for changes in the PPI as a predictor of changes in the CPI. Another price index is called the GDP deflator, or GDP price index. It's another price index that, like the CPI, is used to measure the prices of final goods. It is calculated indirectly, using the difference between nominal GDP, GDP measured at current prices, and real GDP, GDP measured with the prices of a base period. While the CPI tracks only the prices of goods purchased by consumers, the GDP deflator tracks the prices of every good that is part of GDP. This includes government purchases as well as investment purchases by businesses. For example, the government buys fighter jets and farmers buy tractors, but the typical consumer does not. So these items are included in calculations for the GDP deflator, but not for the CPI. Besides the CPI, the PPI, and the GDP deflator, the government uses several other measures of the price level to monitor inflation. Because each price index is different, each one gives us a somewhat different measure of the inflation rate. But the inflation rate that comes from the CPI is the most widely used and most widely reported among them. Price stability exists when the inflation rate is very low. Let's say that inflation is less than 2 or 3% per year. If inflation is only rising by 2 or 3% per year, we call that price stability. With such minimal inflation, changes in the price level from one year to the next are hardly noticeable. The prices of individual goods may rise or fall a great deal, but the overall price level is fairly stable. Unfortunately, the U.S. economy has not always enjoyed price stability. Inflation has been a problem over several periods in the past century. Our most recent bout with high inflation occurred back during the late 1970s and early 1980s. As shown in this figure right here, you can see that since the 1990s and 2000s, we've been in this period right here, we've been experiencing relatively low inflation. But if you go back to the 1970s, look at this period right here, very high inflation during that time period. And that was the last most serious bout of high inflation we experienced in the United States, although you can see it was moderately high even during the early 1980s, or late 1980s, but not nearly as bad. But recently, we have been experiencing price stability. Now, why does price stability matter to consumers? Why is inflation bad? You might think it's because inflation reduces the number of goods we can buy with each dollar that we earn, and that makes us poorer. The first part of this statement is true. The second part, that it makes us poorer, is not necessarily true. So we call this the inflation myth. And let's see why. Inflation does reduce the purchasing power of every dollar you earn. If prices double, the purchasing power of each dollar you earn is cut in half. For example, if candy bars cost 50 cents, okay, and if they cost 50 cents each rather, and you earn $1, your dollar will get you 2 candy bars, okay? But let's say the price of a candy bar doubles to $1. If it does that, now you can only buy 1 candy bar with that dollar instead of 2. So your purchasing power over candy bars is half of what it used to be. Now let's consider the second part of the statement about inflation and see why it's false. Inflation can make you poorer, but there's a good chance it won't. Inflation definitely makes you poorer if you continue to earn the same number of dollars. But in periods of rapidly rising prices, most people also earn more dollars and get wage increases. This is because inflation tends to raise all prices. If you make your living selling furniture, the price you charge for furniture will probably rise along with the prices of the things you buy. If you make your living as a lawyer or an accountant, the price you can charge for your services will probably rise with inflation. Wage earners, too, tend to get bigger raises when prices are rising. So yes, the purchasing power of each dollar you earn falls during periods of inflation, but your earnings will probably increase. The overall effect of inflation on your purchasing power depends on how the increase in your earnings compares with the increase in the price level. Some workers do end up poorer during periods of inflation because their earnings increase by less than the inflation rate. They don't keep up. Some people end up richer because their raises are higher than the inflation rate. And some maintain the same purchasing power because their earnings increase at the same rate as the price level. But you can see that inflation by itself does not automatically make everyone poorer. Even though inflation by itself does not automatically decrease the purchasing power of everyone's income, inflation can be costly for society in other ways. Let's explore a few. The first is what we call shoe leather costs. Oops. When inflation is high, it becomes costly to hold money in your wallet or at home because the purchasing power of cash declines as prices rise. Instead, people prefer to keep their money in the bank where it can earn interest. This is especially true during periods of very high inflation, and this is known as hyperinflation. That can leave a country's currency virtually worthless. Indeed, during the German hyperinflation that I'll talk about later, firms would employ people whose sole job was to take their cash to the bank many times a day in order to invest in something that would hold its value or exchange it for a more stable currency, such as the US dollar. The term shoe leather costs was coined to reflect the cost of the time and effort involved in running to the bank and wearing out the soles of shoes to avoid holding cash. Now, in modern times, with ATMs so readily available as a source of cash when you need it, shoe leather costs may not seem that serious. Even if the inflation rate rose to 10 or 20% per year, it would be easy to leave most of your money in the bank, where it can earn interest that would prevent any decline in its purchasing power. You could withdraw just enough money to cover your spending needs every few days, but with higher inflation rates, say 100% or more, you'd want to take out less money each time. You'd need to make more frequent trips to the ATM, and so would everyone else. Imagine waiting in long lines at the ATM several times a day. That would add up to some serious shoe leather costs. And so hyperinflation usually leaves a country's currency worthless. Let's look at an example here. The country of Zimbabwe in Africa. In Zimbabwe, people have experienced very high inflation. You can see this man here bringing a stack of Zimbabwean dollars to the bank to try to buy that. And what this shows us is everyday consumer items, such as eggs or tomatoes, that sold for billions, if not trillions, of the Zimbabwean dollars. Now imagine if you went to the grocery store in the United States and a dozen eggs cost $1 trillion. Well, in Zimbabwe, it does. Not US dollars, but Zimbabwean dollars. And so you need so many that the currency, the money, is virtually worthless. And you can see pictures here. They even have a $100 trillion bill, or people bring a wheelbarrow full of dollars just to buy a loaf of bread, or this man trying to pay for a meal with just, a huge stack of dollars in his hand. You can see here from this chart that Zimbabwean inflation has reached 100,000% annually. That's huge. And it cost $1.2 billion, Zimbabwean dollars that is, for 2 beers, some water, and dinner. Imagine if you went out to the restaurant and it cost you that much in American dollars for a couple of beers, water, and dinner. And notice, this might be funny, but actually kind of sad. Notice that, they have a sign posted in a bathroom where they tell people to only put toilet paper in the toilet. Don't put cardboard in the toilet, don't put cloth in the toilet, don't put a newspaper in the toilet, but also don't put Zimbabwean dollars in the toilet. Imagine that. We don't have any signs in the United States telling people don't flush your American dollars down the toilet, because no one would do that. They'd be wasting money, but they're so worthless in Zimbabwe that people don't think that they're wasting anything. It's worth flushing them down the toilet. Now, the second cost of high inflation it's what we call menu costs. And this arises when inflation is high because firms must change their prices more often. For example, during the German hyperinflation in the 1920s, restaurants sometimes changed the prices on their menus several times each day. So the term menu costs was coined to reflect the costly inputs such as labor, paper, and printing services used by restaurants whose menus constantly had to be updated. But menu costs apply to other industries as well. For example, when inflation is high, grocery stores must change the prices of every item more frequently. Even if the store uses barcodes and optical scanners, someone has to spend time updating the prices in the computer. When prices change, advertising brochures, billboards, and sales contracts must be updated. All these efforts use resources that could otherwise be put to better use. Inflation, when unexpected, can create winners and losers in a way that is unfair to the losers and costly for the economy. Suppose an entrepreneur named Barbara borrows $1,000 from her friend Michael to start a new real estate business. Michael agrees to lend Barbara the $1,000 for 1 year in exchange for a payment of $1,080 at the end of the year. $30 of this payment is to compensate Michael for being unable to use his $1,000 for the year. $50 of this payment is to compensate for the erosion of purchasing power caused by inflation over the year. Why $50? Because at the time of the loan, Michael and Barbara expect the inflation rate to be 5%. This means they expect the money Barbara pays back to have 5% less purchasing power than the money she borrowed. By paying an extra $50, 5% of the $1,000 borrowed, Michael will be able to buy as much after a year with 5% inflation as he could with $1,000 at the beginning of the year. Now, nobody knows for sure what the inflation rate will be in the future, and it is very possible that Michael and Barbara will be wrong about their predicted rate of 5%. Suppose the inflation rate turns out to be 7% for that year. Barbara will gain from this unexpected inflation because the value of her payments to Michael will be less than planned. Michael will lose because he could buy less than expected with $1,080 received after a year. It will take 7% more than the $1,000, which is $1,070, for Michael to buy as much at the end of the year as he could have at the beginning of the year. That leaves only $1,080 minus $1,070, or $10, as compensation for being unable to use his money for the year. In general, people who borrow money benefit when inflation turns out to be higher than expected, but people who lend money lose from higher than expected inflation. The opposite occurs when inflation is lower than expected. Because borrowers lose and lenders gain because the value of the money to be paid back is higher than expected. The possibility of unexpected inflation makes borrowing and lending more risky. No one knows in advance whether they will be a winner or a loser when they borrow money or they loan money. The added uncertainty of unstable prices can make lenders hesitant to lend and borrowers hesitant to borrow. The result is less lending and borrowing in the economy and fewer prosperous businesses such as Barbara's real estate. Now, the developed countries of the world have achieved price stability over most of the past 2 decades. This figure here shows the average U.S. inflation rate, which is given right here, compared to other what we call Group of 7 or G7 nations. These are countries from 1993 to 2002 and from 2003 to 2011. The G7 consists of some of the world's largest and most advanced economies, like Germany, France, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and Canada. The average inflation rate was fairly low and stable for all of these countries, as you can see reflected here. No one had an inflation rate higher than 3.1%, which is considered price stability. So if we compared inflation during either period with inflation in the 1970s, we would see a great improvement from troubling double-digit rates to low single-digit rates. You've learned that inflation, especially high inflation, is costly to society. But what about deflation? Deflation is a decrease in the price level. Now, you might think that falling prices are cause for celebration. After all, wouldn't you want to pay less for products as time goes on? But even moderate rates of deflation, say 1% or 2% per year, can cause serious problems for an economy. Why? Well, one problem with deflation is that it causes consumers to reduce spending. Why? Because a period of deflation can make people expect more deflation in the future. As a result, consumers who have money in the bank will postpone certain purchases, especially of big-ticket items such as homes or cars. Why spend $250,000 on a home today if the same or similar home can be purchased next year for $50,000 less? When large numbers of people postpone major purchases, aggregate demand decreases. The drop in aggregate demand causes a contraction and the economy to shrink, and leads anxious sellers to reduce prices, leading to still more deflation. Another problem with deflation is that it is not just dollar prices that fall, but also dollar incomes. Debts, on the other hand, do not fall. Suppose you owe $100,000 to a bank for a loan you took out to buy a home. You have to pay back a certain number of dollars on this loan each month. If there is deflation, your income falls, but the monthly payments on your loan remain the same. You will have a harder time making those payments out of your shrinking income. What is true for homeowners applies to any individual or firm that owes money. As prices and incomes fall, it becomes more and more difficult to make payments. Some individuals and firms may reach the state of financial ruin that we call bankruptcy, which means they cannot make their payments. Bankruptcies result in more losses for banks and other lenders. If the losses are great enough, these lenders may themselves go bankrupt, because they count on loan repayments from others to help them make payments of their own. As bankruptcy spreads throughout the economy, lending, even for short periods of time, becomes riskier. Economic activity slows down and spending decreases. Once again, the result is a contraction and possibly a recession or depression. The United States suffered a serious bout of deflation during the recession of the early 1920s, but the worst deflation occurred during the early years of the Great Depression, when average prices dropped 9% in 1931, 9.9% in 1932, and 5.1% in 1933. Deflation during this period led to waves of bankruptcies throughout the economy, a reduction of lending and borrowing, and a decrease in spending. In short, deflation worsened the Depression and made it last longer.